All right, diving in today, folks, we're taking on uh, Gilles Deleuze. Pretty much inescapable when you're talking about 20th century thought. And hey, for you as a philosopher, this is going to be a little deeper than your average intro. You know what I mean?
Right, right. I mean, Toulouse, he really saw philosophy as like a living thing, not just a bunch of old ideas sitting on a shelf. He thought it was all about creating new concepts.
Yeah. He wasn't about analyzing the past. He was about forging ahead, kind of pushing those boundaries. And get this, he actually called himself a pure metaphysician.
Yeah, and in this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack some of that, some of his core ideas, like how he really messed with, like really challenged those traditional assumptions about identity and difference, and the way he built this whole metaphysical system that was really trying to, speak to the intellectual world of his time.
And it's worth remembering, his philosophy was kind of all over the place. I mean that in a good way. He wasn't just stuck in like one little corner of philosophy.
Totally. I mean, he delved into the history of philosophy, right? Like, really gave us fresh perspectives on Hume, Kant, Nietzsche, the whole gang. But he also went deep into the arts, cinema, literature, even painting, treating them as these, like, living spaces where philosophical ideas actually materialize, take shape.
Yeah, and then of course there's his collaboration with Felix Guattari, which, well, let's just say it took things in a whole other direction.
And what's so interesting, thinking about his metaphysical project, is that he was really serious about creating a metaphysics that could handle, that was adequate to, the really big shifts happening in, like, math and science at the time.
So he wanted a philosophy that could hold its own with modern physics, with calculus. That's a pretty ambitious goal.
Definitely ambitious.
Yeah.
And to do that, he had to completely reassess some of our most basic metaphysical ideas.
Okay, so what were some of those like fundamental shifts he was proposing to bring metaphysics into the modern age, the age of science?
So, at the heart of it, he argued that we got to move away from thinking about things in terms of like stable, fixed substances, like those fundamental building blocks.
Okay, I'm following.
Instead, he's pushing for this idea of multiplicity. And instead of essences, those unchanging definitions, he's all about the event, the thing happening right now. And maybe most importantly, he wants us to ditch the concept of possibility and replace it with virtuality.
Whoa. Okay, so we're going from building blocks to like these constantly shifting multiplicities, prioritizing fleeting events over like timeless essences. And then there's this virtual realm, which sounds pretty intriguing, taking over from the idea of possibility. It feels like he's intentionally turning centuries of, metaphysical assumptions upside down.
Right. And it's important to remember that Deleuze, he wasn't on board with this whole end of metaphysics thing that Heidegger was pushing at the time.
Right, right.
In fact, he was very much in line with Bergson, who believed that modern science still needed a solid metaphysical foundation. Deleuze wasn't saying metaphysics was dead. He was trying to rebuild it for a whole new world.
Yeah, and, as we mentioned, this wasn't happening in some, like, isolated intellectual bubble.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
His work is like this amazing tapestry, pulling in ideas from differential calculus, thermodynamics, even molecular biology.
Wow.
Throw in some anthropology, psychoanalysis, linguistics, and even a dash of esoteric thought, and you've got Deleuze in a nutshell. Lyotard called him a library of Babel, which is pretty accurate if you ask me.
Mm.
He didn't see these different areas of knowledge as separate things. He saw them all as interconnected, each one offering insights that could enrich philosophy.
Now let's talk about one of Deleuze's most, controversial, I guess I could say, ideas.
Yeah.
This idea of difference being more important, more fundamental than identity. It seems to be kind of a cornerstone of his whole philosophical system.
Yeah, for sure. It's central to his thinking. Deleuze was really critical of what he called the identitarian tradition in philosophy, this whole long history of focusing on identity, often at the expense of like really understanding difference and its role in how things come to be.
Okay, so how did he start to challenge this long-standing preference for identity in philosophy? His engagement with Kant seems like a pretty important turning point.
It really was.
Mhm.
Deleuze, he had this, well, some might say radical, some might say subversive reading of Kant.
Okay.
He really appreciated the way Kant thought about critique as something immanent. It examines reason from the inside out, looking at its inner workings and limitations, instead of relying on some external standard or authority. And Deleuze very much saw his own philosophy as a philosophy of immanence.
So he was on board with that.
Yeah. But he argued that Kant didn't quite fully realize the the radical potential of his own critique, for a couple of reasons.
Okay, and what were those sticking points for Deleuze? What did he think Kant missed?
Well, first, even though Kant's critique is, focused on consciousness, it ultimately ends up with this transcendental subject, this unifying I that's like the precondition for any experience at all. And Deleuze saw this as sneaking identity back in the form of this transcendental subject, which ends up being, in a way, transcendent to the very field it's supposed to be the condition for.
Okay, so that's one issue.
Right. And second, Deleuze felt that Kant was too preoccupied with the conditions of possible experience, like what has to be in place for us to have any kind of coherent experience. Instead of focusing on that, Deleuze wanted to figure out how experience actually arises in its concrete singularity. How does it really happen, not just what makes it logically possible?
So that distinction between the conditions for possibility and the genesis, the actual coming into being of real specific experiences, that's a big deal for Deleuze.
Absolutely. And it leads him to propose a very different understanding of the transcendental field itself.
Okay, so how does he reimagine that field?
Well, instead of this unified transcendental subject that Kant proposed, this center of consciousness, Deleuze puts forward this idea of an impersonal and pre-individual transcendental field.
Impersonal and pre-individual.
Exactly. He's saying the individual subject, the I we experience as our own, that's not the starting point. It's actually the result, the product of these underlying differential and crucially passive syntheses.
Passive syntheses, what are those?
Think of them as like these habitual bodily rhythms, those unconscious tendencies we have, those subtle ways we choose and remember things. All of those, over time, they kind of come together to create our sense of self.
So it's like our unified self, our I, isn't this fundamental thing. It's more like an emergent pattern, something that arises from this deeper field of, like you said, impersonal pre-individual processes.
Right on. It's like a crystallization or an integration of this dynamic field of passive syntheses, constantly happening, constantly changing. And those individual subjects, they're just kind of temporary whirlpools, patterns that pop up in this flow and then like fold in on themselves, creating that sense of self-awareness.
That's a pretty wild way to think about the relationship between the subject and the world. And this is where his concept of transcendental empiricism comes in, right? A term that on the surface seems kind of contradictory.
Yeah, it does sound a bit paradoxical at first, but Deleuze uses it to describe his overall philosophical approach, which really hinges on two main principles. First, abstract concepts, things like subject, object, state, the whole, those don't actually explain anything on their own.
Okay.
Those are what need to be explained. We have to understand them as the results of these more fundamental processes, these passive syntheses we talked about.
So we're not taking those abstract concepts for granted. We're trying to dig down and see where they come from.
Right. And the second principle is that philosophy isn't about finding some eternal truths or rediscovering universal laws. The real goal is to figure out the unique conditions under which something truly new comes into being.
So it's not about representing reality as it is, but about understanding how novelty emerges, how things become different, how creation actually happens.
Exactly. And, it's worth noting that Deleuze's critique of Kant, it wasn't completely out of the blue. The work of Salomon Maimon really paved the way for some of his ideas.
Oh, right. Maimon. He's not exactly a household name in philosophy.
He's kind of an unsung hero. But Deleuze saw him as a really important forerunner. Maimon, he argued that Kant's critical project, while brilliant, was missing something. It needed more than just a method for figuring out the conditions of possibility. It needed a truly genetic method, a way to explain the actual production of knowledge, morality, even reason itself.
So he wanted to understand not just what could be thought, but how thinking actually happens.
Exactly. He was after the conditions for real experience, not just possible experience.
And Maimon found the key to this genetic method in the concept of difference, right?
Right on. He said that, yeah, we need identity to think, to recognize things. But it's difference that really drives the engine of thought, that makes it productive, that makes it real, that moves it forward.
And you mentioned these two Maimonian exigencies, this need for understanding the genesis of real experience and this focus on difference, serving as a guide for Deleuze's early work.
Yeah, totally. They're like the North Star of his early thought. You can see it in his work on Nietzsche, for example. Deleuze thought Nietzsche took Kant's critique to the next level.
In what way?
Well, for Nietzsche, critique wasn't just about pointing out false claims. It was about questioning even the things we consider true, our knowledge, our values, everything. Deleuze saw Nietzsche's genealogical method as precisely that kind of genetic inquiry Maimon was calling for. And then there's the will to power, which for Deleuze is this fundamental force of affirmation and differentiation, Nietzsche's principle of difference.
So it's not about domination or control. It's about this creative affirmative force that's all about becoming different, differentiating.
Yeah, exactly. Deleuze really highlighted how these non-dialectical affirmative forces of difference are actually productive, how they create new things.
Now, another big influence, Bergson. What were the key ideas Deleuze took from Bergson?
Oh man, two huge concepts, virtuality and multiplicity. Remember, Deleuze wanted to move away from static possibilities and get to this dynamic understanding of how the real comes to be.
Right, right.
So virtuality, as he understood it through Bergson, became the name for this generative ground, this source of real experience.
And this virtual, it's totally different from how we usually think about the possible, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. Bergson argued that the way we typically understand possible is actually kind of backwards. We see something real and then imagine it not existing, and that's how we get this idea of possible. And then we think the real is just the possible plus existence. Deleuze, following Bergson, rejected this whole idea. Instead, he said the virtual is completely real, just in a different mode of reality than the actual.
Okay, so it's not just a bunch of blueprints waiting to be built. It's more active, more alive than that.
For sure. And the key to the virtual is its differential makeup. Deleuze had this really important idea. The ground, the source of something, can't resemble the thing it produces. He was always critiquing philosophers for tracing, for trying to explain things by just saying they have the same identity in some deeper transcendental realm.
Okay.
Like, he criticized Kant for basically mirroring the structure of experience in his concept of the transcendental field.
So if our experience is full of individual things and objects, then the virtual, that ground, has to be fundamentally different. It has to be impersonal, pre-individual.
Exactly. The virtual makes real experience possible, but it doesn't have identity in the way we experience it in the actual world. Those identities, they come about as products of these processes that resolve, integrate, actualize this underlying differential field of the virtual. And, the virtual is about the genesis of experience, not just its logical possibility.
And multiplicity is the term Deleuze uses, again from Bergson, to describe this differential field of the virtual.
Right. But he's careful to say he's using multiplicity as a substantive, not just a description.
Okay.
When we use multiple as just a description, we run into that classic philosophical problem of the one and the many. But as a substantive, multiplicity refers to a way of being where the important thing is to distinguish between different types of multiplicities, like Bergson did with qualitative and quantitative multiplicities. It's about understanding these basic differences at the root of being, not just getting caught up in this back and forth between unity and plurality.
Okay, so we've got Maimon pushing for a genetic method and a principle of difference, Nietzsche giving us genealogy and the will to power, Bergson with virtuality and multiplicity. Who's next in Deleuze's Hall of Fame? Spinoza, right?
Absolutely. Deleuze had massive respect for Spinoza, saw him as a real guiding light. And one of the biggest things he took from Spinoza was this idea of univocity in ontology.
Okay, univocity. So that's the idea that being is said in a single sense for everything that exists. How does that fit with Deleuze's focus on difference? Seems a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's a good point. Univocity, as opposed to equivocity or analogy, was so important for Deleuze precisely because it allowed him to build a philosophy where difference isn't ultimately subordinate to some bigger overarching identity. In his rather unique reading of Spinoza, being is affirmed in a single sense across all of reality, but that single sense is difference itself. And the thing that makes up this difference, that drives it, is difference in degrees of power, puissance.
And this puissance, it's not the same as pouvoir, which is more about domination or control, right?
Exactly. Deleuze, taking it straight from Spinoza, uses puissance to talk about a more basic, immanent kind of power. It's the power to act, to be affected, to connect with things, to create assemblages. It's more about praxis, collective action, rather than poiesis, where you have some superior force shaping passive matter. Puissance is all about the inherent capacity of things to come together and form new unities while still respecting the differences of their parts. So Deleuze takes Spinoza's core idea of univocal being and reinterprets it as a univocity of difference, all through this dynamic concept of puissance. You could call it Spinozism without substance, where the focus is on a universe defined by its variations in power in this modal differential universe.
Wow, that's a pretty radical reinterpretation of Spinoza.
And then we have Leibniz, the last of these big philosophical influences. He seems to have had a particularly strong impact on how Deleuze understood this virtual realm. Absolutely. Deleuze's take on Leibniz, especially in his book The Fold, is really fascinating. He basically takes Leibniz's philosophy and strips it of its theological baggage. He wants to look at the virtual realm on its own as something independent from any particular world or any individual monads.
And this is where the analogy with Borges' The Garden of Forking Paths comes in, right?
Exactly. Deleuze loved that story, where a single choice explodes into all these different timelines, each of them equally real in their own branch. Leibniz, in his Theodicy, had this similar but more theologically bound picture of infinite possible worlds, with God choosing to actualize the best one. Deleuze takes this idea of branching possibilities and uses it to transform Kant's transcendent ideas, God, world, and self, into something new within this reimagined neo-Leibnizian framework.
Okay, so how do these traditionally transcendent ideas change in Deleuze's system?
Well, first, God is no longer this transcendent being who picks the best possible world from a menu. Instead, God becomes a pure, immanent process, like this creative force that affirms the very things that can't exist together, those incompossibilities, and it moves through them instead of getting rid of them.
Okay, and what about the world?
The world, it's not some harmonious, pre-ordered thing anymore. It becomes what Deleuze, borrowing from Joyce, calls a chaosmos, a chaotic world where all those divergent paths, those bifurcations, those incompossibilities, they all belong to the same underlying virtual reality. And they create these inherent dissonances, these conflicts that never fully resolve. This is like the opposite of Leibniz, who said that disharmonies only exist in other possible worlds so that ours could be perfect.
And the self, how does that change?
Individual selves, subjects, they aren't these self-contained, isolated monads anymore. They're more like these nomadic subjects, always being pulled in different directions, never fully settled, always open to these divergent series and impossible combinations that push them beyond any fixed identity. So Deleuze keeps some Leibnizian influences, especially this idea of a rich and differentiated virtuality. But he changes it by getting rid of that pre-established harmony and emphasizing the realness and creative power of these incompossibilities that exist within our single virtual world.
And all these different threads, all these influences, they come together in Deleuze's most important book, Difference and Repetition.
Exactly. It came out in '68, and you can really see it as the culmination of all that early work, all those historical studies. It's his big attempt to build a philosophy of difference based on that initial critique from Maimon. And as we've talked about, it's a major shift away from Kant's focus on the universal conditions for any possible experience.
Right. He wanted to understand the genesis of real, singular experience, the experience of a specific person at a particular moment with all its unique characteristics. And he argued that this genesis, this coming into being, had to be fundamentally rooted in difference.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that even though difference and repetition breaks away from Kant in a lot of ways, it's still operating within this framework of transcendental philosophy, just a very different one.
Okay.
At its heart, transcendental philosophy is about critiquing philosophies that try to go beyond experience. It does that by establishing the necessary conditions for the processes that are inherent to experience itself, those syntheses. Deleuze is on board with this critical approach, even though he redefines the key terms and goals.
And the book itself is structured to reflect this project, right? Building up to Deleuze's own philosophy, with that crucial third chapter on the image of thought serving as a turning point.
Absolutely. The first two parts, they're like Deleuze working through the history of philosophy, carefully picking out and defining these key concepts of difference in itself and repetition for itself. Then chapter 3, on the image of thought, acts like a bridge, or, as Deleuze called it, the prolegomena to philosophy. It clears the ground for his own philosophy, which he really lays out in those later chapters.
So let's break down some of these core concepts. What exactly does he mean by difference in itself? Sounds a little cryptic.
Well, difference in itself means we're talking about difference that isn't secondary to or derived from identity. Usually in philosophy, difference is seen as a relationship between things that already have their own identities. Like we say, X is different from Y. But Deleuze flips this on its head. He argues that identity itself is a product, something that comes after a more fundamental relationship between these basic elements of different differentials that don't have fixed identities in themselves. Difference becomes this primary transcendental principle that's actually the reason for all the diversity we see in the world. Think of it like the difference in electrical potential that makes a spark jump between 2 points. It's not just a property of the points themselves, it's the condition that makes the whole phenomenon happen.
And repetition for itself, that also breaks away from how we normally think about repetition as just the return of something identical.
For sure, with repetition for itself, it's not about copying an original. It's about repeating the underlying condition that makes real experience possible. That differential genetic condition, each and every time something comes into being. Deleuze was really engaged with Nietzsche's concept of eternal return. And for him, repetition isn't about the same exact thing coming back again and again. It's this constant reaffirmation of the differential process itself. In the end, difference in repetition argues that individuation, that process of things becoming individual entities, is the direct result of this actualization, this resolution of a differentiated virtual field of ideas, of multiplicities. And each act of individuation subtly changes those virtual fields in a process he calls counter-effectuation.
Now, you said that in Chapter 3 on the image of thought, Deleuze talks about these postulates of the dogmatic image of thought. What is this dogmatic image and what's wrong with it, according to Deleuze?
Well, for Deleuze, the dogmatic image of thought is like this set of assumptions that we often don't even realize we have. They're kind of the foundation for a lot of Western philosophy and just, how we naturally tend to think. He lays out 8 postulates, all connected to each other. The first 4 deal with our supposed natural ability to think correctly, this assumption that both the subject who thinks and the object being thought about are unified, and this idea that representation is at the heart of how we understand knowledge.
Representation. So that's the idea that our thinking is all about creating mental copies of the external world, where difference is always secondary to some underlying identity. You mentioned Aristotle and Porphyry as examples of this representational way of thinking.
Yeah, exactly. In this representational framework, difference is usually understood through these 4 ideas: identity within a concept, opposition of predicates, analogy in judgment, and resemblance in perception. Think about Aristotle's categories, how they're all organized. Specific differences only exist within these shared categories, and differences between individuals are often seen as like little variations on a common theme based on how much they resemble each other. Deleuze argues that this whole structure keeps difference subordinate to a pre-existing framework of identity and conceptual unity.
Okay, and Deleuze's alternative is this transcendent exercise of our faculties, triggered by this encounter with intensity and sensation.
That's right. After going through those first 4 postulates, he presents his own theory of how thought really works. To grasp difference in itself, we need to be forced to think, not just rely on our usual categories and ways of recognizing things. This forced thinking happens when we encounter something, a sensation, an experience that's so intense, so new, so disruptive, that we can't just fit it into our existing understanding. It forces our sensibility to work in a new way, a transcendent exercise of sensibility.
So it's like this encounter with the raw, undifferentiated sentiendum.
Yeah, exactly. And Deleuze draws on Kant's concept of the sublime here, this experience of something overwhelming that causes a kind of like discordant harmony between our different faculties. This free form of difference inherent in this intensity, it moves through our faculties, making them operate in this new, non-representational way. Unlike Kant, who thought this conflict was resolved by reason, Deleuze sees it leading to a kind of fragmented self, which ultimately pushes us to think difference in itself in the realm of ideas.
And you mentioned this important distinction between intensive and extensive quantities. How does that fit into this idea of encounter and the genesis of thought?
This distinction, which he goes deep into in chapters 4 and 5, is key to understanding how the virtual realm becomes the concrete world we experience. Extensive quantities, things like size, volume, spatial extension, they can be divided without changing their nature. You can cut a meter into centimeters and it's still measuring length. Intensive magnitudes, on the other hand, things like temperature, pressure, the pitch of a sound, you can't divide those in the same way. If you divide them too much, they change qualitatively.
Right, like if you lower the temperature enough, water turns to ice.
Exactly. Deleuze says intensity has this transcendental status. It's the underlying condition for extensive space and measurable qualities. And these intensive processes are structured and governed by the dynamics of virtual ideas or multiplicities.
So intensity is like this hidden force field that gives rise to the world we can measure and perceive.
That's it. And an idea, a multiplicity, in Deleuze's terms, it isn't some static concept. It's a dynamic process, a field of potential. It involves differential elements, the basic components, differential relations, the rules of interaction between those elements, and singularities, the points where the system can shift and change qualitatively. Like phonemes in language, which Deleuze uses as an example. Each phone only has meaning within a system.
Right.
They relate to each other in specific ways that define the structure of a particular language. And these relations create singularities, those points where the system can evolve, like the great vowel shift in English.
You also used the example of hurricanes, which I thought was really helpful.
Oh, yeah. So you have the air and water flows as the differential elements, their complex interactions as the differential relations, and then the formation of the eye wall as a singularity, a point of sudden qualitative change. It's a good analogy to visualize how these concepts work together.
It definitely helps. And Deleuze emphasizes that an idea, in this sense, is a concrete universal. It's not some abstract thing separated from specifics, but rather, he uses Bergson's analogy, it's like white light that contains the full spectrum of potential differences. Those different colors aren't pre-existing things inside a concept. They're coexisting intensities within the idea itself.
Exactly. The relationship between the virtual idea and its actualization, like a specific shade of red, is all about differentiation and actualization.
And that leads us back to the idea of individuation, of real things coming into being as the actualization of these virtual ideas through those intensive processes we talked about.
Yes. Deleuze proposes this three-part ontology: the virtual, the intensive, and the actual. Actual entities, the things we experience in the world, they emerge from these intensive morphogenetic processes, which are guided by the virtual multiplicities. So you have these impersonal, intensive processes of individuation happening beneath the levels that we actually perceive. And deeper down, you have the pre-individual field of the virtual, pure differential relations and singularities. It's super important to keep those two levels distinct. The intense impersonal field of individuation, those active processes of becoming, and the virtual pre-individual field of differential relations, which is the structure of potential itself. He even uses Gilbert Simondon's theory of crystallization to explain this, how stable crystal structures emerge from this unstable solution through the self-organizing process.
So difference and repetition gives us this incredibly complex framework for understanding difference, not as something secondary, but as this primary creative force. And it shows us how individual things emerge as the actualization of these dynamic virtual multiplicities. It's a pretty radical challenge to some of the most basic ideas in traditional metaphysics.
It really is. And for any philosopher, Deleuze's work in difference and repetition is like this powerful tool for rethinking our most fundamental categories and assumptions. It forces us to think about the conditions for novelty and creation, not just in our thoughts and culture, but in the very nature of reality itself.
This has been a really illuminating deep dive into the core of Deleuze's early work. We've covered a lot: his critique of identity, this focus on the primacy of difference, the impact of thinkers like Maimon, Nietzsche, Bergson, Spinoza, and Leibniz, and his complex model of how individuation works, with the virtual, the intensive, and the actual.
We saw how Deleuze wanted to build a metaphysics that could handle modern science by replacing old ideas with these more dynamic concepts of multiplicity, event, and virtuality. And his emphasis on difference as a creative force, along with his development of transcendental empiricism, offers some really radical alternatives to traditional philosophical frameworks.
So, as you continue on your philosophical journey, here's something to think about. How might Deleuze's concept of the virtual change how you understand abstract ideas like possibility, necessity, and contingency? What new perspectives might open up if we shift away from thinking about fixed possibilities and start embracing this dynamic, ever-changing realm of virtualities that are constantly being actualized? That's a pretty powerful thought to leave you with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.